The Elder Scrolls, the history of Nirn, thousands of years constructed and bound together by countless historians detailing millions of perspectives, some accurately, some inaccurately, but after all, history is written by the victor. Regardless of the elusive nature of truth, we as teachers of the Elder Scrolls lore do our best to present the most accurate or most likely versions of events. Welcome back to FudgeMuppet, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott, and today we are taking you through the events of the Merethic Era. If you have been following the channel for a while, you may know that we have made comprehensive videos on each of the eras of recorded history, meaning that there are somewhat accurate dates and an actual timescale of years. Those videos are linked down below, the first, second, third, and fourth eras explained. But today, we endeavor to explain the Merethic Era, a time of myth and mystery, a time without hard dates and fewer records, a turbulent time that makes it hard to distinguish myth from fact, a place where the two frequently intermingle. So unlike all those other videos we have made, this one is likely to be different. We have less years, but rather frames of time, and we have events that can be interpreted, and there's lots of conjecture, so what are we to do? For this video, we're going to give our best shot at making sense of this mythic time, the time of elves, magic, and mystery. Without further ado, let's get into it. The major pinned event that separates the chaotic dawn era of creation and the Merethic Era is the construction of the Adamantine Tower, later known as the Durrani Tower. It was built around 2,500 years before the beginning of the First Era, and the gods would hold the convention at this tower and set the laws of Mundus. Now, this period, known as the early Merethic Era, had Tamriel characterized by civilizations of beast people such as Khajiit, Argonians, Imgur, and other beast folk like the bird peoples that Topal the Pilot would discover in the heart of Cyrodiil. Interestingly, according to some theories, the Aldmer who would become the Bosmer of Valenwood arrived in Tamriel earlier than the other Aldmer, and over much time they were transformed into the Bosmer. This order of events also makes a lot of sense with the Khajiit origin story in mind, considering they believe that the Khajiit were made by Azura from a race of elves. Regardless, there are scarce records of these times, and all we are left with is essentially conjecture. It is often believed this was the time when the runestones of Cyrodiil were also constructed, perhaps by the bird people. We later move into the Merethic Era, where we have the Aldmer, the Elves of Aldmeris, also known as Old Elnafey, who have become lost and scattered at sea. The Aldmer find the Somerset Isles, and from there adventurers like Topal the Pilot endeavor to find their way home to Aldmeris, but are not successful. Instead, Topal would end up mapping much of Tamriel, which would then incentivize many elves to depart and explore the far reaches. Topal himself traded with the native bird people of the Eight Isles in central Cyrodiil. The valuable land was traded for the gift of literacy, and later this is where the Aelid Elves would rise to power, with many of their aesthetic designs perhaps being inspired by the native beastfolk. These bird-like beastfolk disappear as the Aelids rise, and the White Gold Tower is constructed. Some year around this time, the Crystal Tower on the Somerset Isles is also constructed. While some specifics on Aldmeri divergence are unknown, such as the exact origins of the Snow Elves or the Dwemer, all we know is that at this time they divide and the races of Mer become distinct. The most pivotal and fundamental event that explains two key changes is the Velothi exodus from the Somerset Isles. The followers of the prophet Veloth would follow the good Daedra and seek a new way of life. An exodus began, but Trinimac and his followers would try to stop them. Boethia, in response, swallowed Trinimac and excreted the Daedric prince Malakath in his place, turning all Trinimac's followers into the Orsma, better known as the Orcs. The Velothi exodus was then successful, creating the race of Kaima, who would inhabit the land of Resdayn, aka modern-day Morrowind. A golden age begins, a period of so-called high-Velothi culture thrives, long-lived Kaima clans remain steadfast in their devotion to fundamentalist ancestor worship. Linked below is a video that explains the Velothi in much greater detail. Another distinguished group of elves would be the Durrani clan, who sailed to High Rock, discovered the Adamantine Tower, and claimed it, hence why it is later known as the Durrani Tower. And then we come to the late Merethic Era, which would be characterized by two major events. The fall of high Velothi culture occurred, and Kaima degenerate into tribal cultures that would one day become the Great Houses of Morrowind, or the Ashlanders. At this same time, Dwemer freehold colonies were being constructed. The second great event that we have a rough time estimate for is that about 1,000 years prior to the beginning of the First Era is when the first migrations from the northern land of Atmora occurred. According to archaeologists who studied the earliest known human settlements of Hammerfell, High Rock, and Cyrodiil, waves of men, both settlers and raiders, would venture across the Sea of Ghosts and arrive at the northern coast of Tamriel. These humans would eventually become known as the Nedes, or Nedic people, and spread throughout Tamriel. However, the Elves were far superior in terms of sorcery and intellect, and in many of the places they settled, they were soon dominated by the races of Mer. Two of the foremost examples are the Nedic people of Cyrodiil, who were enslaved and subjugated by the Wild Elves, also better known as the Aelids, but also the Nedic people of High Rock would become subject to a caste system with the Durrani Elves at the top. The Durrani Elves would breed with the Nedic people, sometimes willingly, most commonly compelled or coerced, and as a result of this, the Breton race, or Manmer, the half-breeds, would be born. Now, one must consider the sheer scope of time here that has gone by. 1,500 years has gone by without men appearing on Tamriel. Before that, there were the Elves, and before them, the Beast Folk, though it is unknown how long was in between them. The Elves could have showed up a few hundred years after the Adamantine Tower was constructed, perhaps it was even 500 or 700 years after, but I would wager that the Elves have been in Tamriel for at least 700 to 800 years before men began arriving. Likely even more, but regardless, without concrete dates, it's hard to know. So in total, there's about 4,450 years of recorded history at the time of Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and that's broken down into 4 eras. Preceding that is roughly another 2,500 years of the Merethic Era, totaling 6,950 years since the Adamantine Tower was created. 6,950 years ago in our timeline takes you back to 4,931 BC, a time before the Bronze Age, a time before even the potter's wheel was invented. Whereas in the Elder Scrolls universe, on Tamriel, structures such as the White Gold Tower were being built by the inhabitant elves. Anyways, that point of digression was just to give you the grand sense of scope here in the Elder Scrolls timeline. The Merethic Era itself is 2,500 years, which may seem rather small because of the lack of recorded history, but it's definitely not. So let's take it back to the timeline. 1,000 years before the beginning of the First Era, the first Nedic peoples have settled Tamriel and have been enslaved or subjugated by the various Elven peoples. However, of course, there are also those which have remained free. The Somerset Isles are dominated by the High Elves, the Aldmer, Valenwood ruled by the Bosmer, the Wood Elves, elsewhere by the Khajiit, Blackmarsh by the Argonians, Hammerfell, a mix of Nedic peoples, goblins, and essentially it's just a desert land for the taking of whoever wants it. High Rock is ruled by the Durrani Elves, Skyrim by the Snow Elves, also known as the Falmer, Cyrodiil by the Aelids, and Morrowind, then known as Resdayn, is contested by the Chimer tribes and the Dwemer colonies. So what changes? How do we get to the land of Tamriel, dominated by the races of man in more contemporary eras? Well, arguably one of the greatest and pivotal characters in history happened, and his name was Ysgramor. Ysgramor took a mighty colonization fleet from the northern human lands of Atmora and arrived at Sarek Head, the very most northern tip at Skyrim's coast. They arrive at this frigid land and build the first Nordic city on Tamriel, Sarthal. You may be familiar with this place, it's one of the first locations you go to in the College of Winterhold questline in Skyrim. Ysgramor is actually considered the first human historian, as he develops a runic transcription of Nordic speech based on Elvish principles. That's right, elves and man actually got along for a while, but then a fateful night known as the Night of Tears would occur. The exact reasons for this event are unknown, lost to time, but what essentially happened was that the Falmer, the Snow Elves, came down upon the city of Sarthal and violently slaughtered every single Atmoran settler. Only Ysgramor and his 2 sons escaped. It was initially speculated that the Snow Elves feared the Atmorans' growing population and potential expansion, so they cut the cancer before it spread. However, with knowledge that the Eye of Magnus was deep within Sarthal, we can speculate that it was instead that the Atmorans had discovered the Eye of Magnus where they built their city, and the elves feared such a powerful object falling into the hands of men, so they did what they had to reclaim it. But of course these actions would bite them back, and Ysgramor with his 2 sons managed to sail home to Atmora, rally an army of 500 companions, and return. Now, according to Codlac Whitemane, the recent harbinger of the Companions, he says that the Companions are nearly 5,000 years old, which places the events of Ysgramor's return sometime roughly around 500 years before the First Era begins. So, in a short time, Ysgramor and his companions come back for revenge, slaughter every snow elf they could see on Skyrim, and even Solstheim, defeating the Snow Prince. They expanded to all corners of the land, and the desperate snow elves who wished to escape the slaughter made a deal with the Dwemer in their underground cities and accepted a cruel deal in desperation, a deal that would result in the mutation into the vile Falmer that you know today. So the good old Nords set up shop pretty much everywhere, bringing their culture and religion. Specifically, a certain cult grew quite powerful. This organization was the Dragon Cult, and the Dragon Priests gained more and more power, becoming more and more tyrannical. Eventually, the Nords, under the iron fist of the dragons and their Dragon Priests, were pushed too far, and so they retaliated. This was known as the Dragon Wars, and thousands upon thousands were killed, but eventually, with the help of Paarthurnax and Kine, the Nords were able to turn the tides, banish Alduin to the future, and eventually win the war. The Dragon Cult then essentially became extinct, apart from the undead priests still in their barrows. So in short, the Nords as we know them only arrived in Tamriel about 500 years before the First Era, which puts all the Dragon War events between then and the First Era. So to recap the scale of time with a little bit of my interpretation, 2,500 years before the First Era, the Adamantine Tower was built, and for about 500-ish years as an estimate, I imagine it was only dominated by the Aboriginal beast folk. About 2,000 years before the First Era came the first Elves from Aldmeris. They found Somerset, and then began spreading all over Tamriel, constructing, changing, and mingling. And then, about 1,000 years before the First Era, came waves of men from Atmora, who would settle and raid, becoming the Nedes peoples of Tamriel. Then, about 500 years after that, 500 years before the First Era, came the Atmorans, what we call the Proto-Nords, who would become the Nordic people. Then finally we have the end of the Merethic Era, with the first actual historical date being year 1 of the First Era, when King Eplir founded the Cameron dynasty of Valenwood. But don't worry, that's not all there is to the Merethic Era. You have the general scheme of things and an idea of time, but there are some events that don't really have an exact place, mainly because of a lack of historical dates. So for example, we know that the Et Arda, the Shezarene, the mysterious man, the immortal hero known as Pelennor Whitestrake, roams the lands of Tamriel, gathering armies, conquering lands, ruling and then abandoning his kingdoms to start all over again. The man who had a penchant for slaughtering elves went by many names throughout his immortal life, such as Harold Hairy Breeks, Ismir, Hans the Fox, and of course as we know him mainly, Pelennor Whitestrake. But of course these events would have all happened post man's arrival on Tamriel, meaning 1,000 years before the First Era or later. Another important event to consider that has many thematic messages is the war on the continent to the west in Yakuta. The Yakutans were fighting the left-handed elves, and the Hunding manifests as an avatar called Diagna, who brings orichalc weapons to the Yakutans, helping them defeat the left-handed elves for good. So the theme that I'm talking about is elven downfall. The Merethic Era is the time of elven dominance on Tamriel and presumably on Yakuta as well. But towards the end of the Merethic Era, this begins to change, and it gives way to the races of man on both Tamriel and Yakuta. To be honest, this time and era of history is really hard to document, and it's likely that I've missed many smaller events all throughout Tamriel. In fact, most of the myths and legends you hear are set in the Merethic Era. Like I said, it's an era where most of the lines between myth and history are blurred. But hopefully this video has been successful in explaining to you the general gist of the Merethic Era, giving you an idea of the timescale, and putting into perspective just how ancient this era really is. I sometimes sometimes wonder if it truly was a crazier, more magical era, or perhaps it is just hyperbole and exaggeration for effect. Compare the stories of the Iliad, the Battle of Troy with gods and demigods with tragic heroes, whereas as far as archaeology and history is concerned, there was Troy, and there is evidence it was destroyed. I know in the Elder Scrolls world for sure there is actual magic and tangible gods, but still, there is great room for exaggeration, but who doesn't love a more exciting story? Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video a lot, and if you did, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this. I would be down to try and do a Dawn Era video, but I'm not really sure about it because there is pretty much zero timeline for that. It's just multiple different creation stories, so perhaps you would be better served watching the complete guide to gods video linked in the description, but then again, perhaps I could try to consolidate all of the creation stories into a general chronological time frame. We'll see. Let me know if you guys would like to see the Dawn Era explained, and don't forget that there are the 4 eras of recorded history explained in the description below for you to check out. Social media links are also there if you want to reach us. My name is Scott from FudgeMuppet, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.